ahead to what the papers will be bringing us on Sunday morning. Joining me tonight, the political commentator Joe Phillips and the political editor of the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People, Nigel Nelson. Good to have you both with us. Thank you very much for staying up this Saturday evening, and thank you to staying up at home to watch with us and hear what Joe and Nigel make of the papers. Let's start with the Observer. It's unsurprising that most of the front pages are dominated by the continuing fallout from the murder, from the killing of Sir David Amess. The Common Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, calls for a kinder form of political discourse following Sir David's death. The Telegraph says the murder suspect Ali Harvey Ali was not known to MI5, although he had been referred to the Counter-Terrorism Prevent programme. In the wake of the attack, Home Secretary Priti Patel is devising a police protection plan for MPs. That makes the front page of The Independent. The Sunday Express also says the suspect was flagged for de-radicalisation. Its headline is, "We won't let terror win." The Sunday Times reports that David's last act was to help children understand democracy. The paper details a phone conversation that ended just 3 minutes before he was stabbed. So, let's begin. Joe, do you want to kick us off this evening? And shall we start with the Sunday Times, I think, if that's okay with you?
Yeah, this is, as you just alluded to, Sean, a rather graphic detail of a conversation he was having with a chap called Richard Hillgrove, whose daughter was going to be paired with David Amess as part of the Children's Parliament campaign that the MP was heavily involved with. And it's, it just brings home the suddenness and the shock that this man was having a Zoom call or having a phone call with David Amess. They ended the call because he had to go and do his constituency surgery, and with minutes afterwards, we know what happened. He was attacked and later died. So it just sort of brings it home, that awfulness, I think, and also underlines what everybody has been saying, Sean, that, he was a man who was committed, busy, involved with things like the Children's Parliament, any number of things. The words that have rung out in the last 36 hours have been dominated by kindness. And it's that kindness, that involvement, and again, it comes across through this report of the phone call.
Nigel, he was accessible to the public, as that demonstrates, and he was really good at getting publicity for the causes he believed in. I mean, presumably he was somebody in your line of business that you dealt with on a fairly regular basis.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I've known David or knew David for 35 years. And the one thing I most remember about him was that I don't think I've ever seen him not smile. If you see all the pictures of him since his tragic death, that all of them have him smiling. And so if you ran into him, that if you were feeling a bit low, just a few minutes with him would immediately sort of lift your spirits. And of course, he'd been a fixture of the House of Commons for a long time. He was there 3 years before I was, and I've been there 35 years. He was as much of a fixture as, say, Big Ben. And of course, the House of Commons now will feel like Parliament without that clock. He really will be dreadfully missed.
Yeah, he kind of carved out quite a unique role, hadn't he? I was struck. Two things struck me. One was the smile. I mentioned this last night. It was a sort of almost Cheshire cat-like quality to his smile. It was still in the air a couple of moments after he'd gone, partly because of the impression he left on people. But then listening to, I don't know if you will have heard this interview, either of you, but listening to one of his colleagues who used to work for him, Duncan Smith, Tim Montgomery, who's talking about how he's going through a tough time with his mental health and how incredibly supportive David Amess was, to the point of saying, look, if it gets darker, you promise me you will call me, and how insistent he was. And the effort he made to bring other people up and cheer other people up and encourage and support them is kind of quite a tribute to him. Nigel, also, I was just going to mention the people, because this sums up the fact that other people are affected by this very, very directly. And they're, of course, not just his friends and his colleagues and the people who knew him through his work, but above all, his family.
Yes, and our thoughts really should be with them. I mean, his wife and his 5 children. And the point about the People story is this comes from a documentary he made for a sixth former going back 10 years. And what that is actually talking about is the fact that he was talking about how politics, because it is so all-embracing and takes up pretty much every minute of your working day, he was talking about the family paying a really heavy price for this. And I think that we sometimes forget. I mean, politicians come somewhere below journalists in public esteem. But the amount of hours you actually have to put in, the places you have to be, all these things build up to a real sort of, a real burden on your family. And here was somebody, a devout Catholic, a loving father, a loving husband. I mean, he absolutely adored his family. And it must have been very painful to him to see the effect his job was having on them.
Yeah, Joe, you've been both a political journalist and a political press officer, and you must have had these conversations in the past with people about the kind of the extra pressure that is put on the shoulders of their family. Deal with the flack, but also just have to give up the amount of time for their partner's career.
And you're never off duty. You can't just sort of pop out down the road to the newsagents or to the butchers or something, because somebody will stop you and say, oh, I've got a problem about this, that or the other. And it's the same for the film. And it's particularly difficult, I think, for, that lovely picture on the front of the People, on the front of Nigel's page of David and his wife Julia and their daughters. Now, those girls will have been children when he started as an MP, so that's all through their growing up. So, all those parents' evenings that he perhaps couldn't get to because there was a vote in the Commons, all those other events. And you do have to share your political partner with the rest of the constituency, and, it's tough. It's a big ask of a family.
Yeah, I was looking at his age and just thinking, well, he was 69. This might have been his last parliament, who knows, but doubtless he and his wife were looking forward to what comes after work, and perhaps at last getting back some of that time that they'd lost, if one ever can, to his commitment to public life. Take us on, if you would, Joe, to the Sunday Telegraph, which talks a bit more about the suspect in this case.
Yes, well, we now know, we knew that he was 25. He has been named by sources this evening as Ali Harbi Ali, who is British but of Somalian heritage, apparently. Other reports say that his father was quite a senior advisor to the Somali government. What's interesting about this Sunday Telegraph story is that he was not known to MI5, the security services, but he had been referred to the Prevent programme several years ago. But it doesn't seem as though that particularly came to anything. The other part of this story that is also quite interesting is that David Amess, in common with so many, every MP, had threats. Earlier today and yesterday, we've been hearing catalogues of the number of threats, including Yvette Cooper's constituency office manager. 100 death threats a week. Can you imagine having to deal with that, and then dealing with the people that are coming in really need your help? But so David Amess had a particularly unpleasant threat, according to the Sunday Telegraph, but it's not apparently linked to what happened on Friday. So there are a lot of questions to be asked. Whether this was a lone wolf, what the background was. We won't really know for a couple of days, I wouldn't have thought.
It's a very kind of sombre photograph, Nigel, on the front of the Telegraph, just as on the Sunday Times with Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson. But this is the terrible aftermath of an incident. Who knows whether or not this was in any way linked to any previous threats, or whether it comes out of a clear blue sky. And I suppose that's the problem, isn't it, Nigel? That you can have 100 death threats a week. How do you know if any of them are actually significant or not, or whether they're just kind of angry people saying stupid things?
I think this is the problem of social media, which we're still failing to put any controls over. And MPs are particularly vulnerable to this. Yes, they do get threatened an awful lot. And what they should do, and most do, is that when a death threat comes in, they report it to the police. and the police do their best to actually track down the person who is making that threat. But we live in this world of social media where people, the keyboard warriors, can sit in their bedrooms and think they can say what they like and forget the effect it has on other people. And that's the problem for politicians. They're right in the firing line for this, and until we can get a grip of social media and the companies do more about it, more of this is going to happen.
This is illustrated, Nigel, by the Observer. We must end the hatred aimed at our MPs, says the Commons Speaker. Lindsay Hall is saying the conversation has to be kinder and based on respect. I mean, Joe, we were here 5 years ago, weren't we, when Joe Cox was killed, and well, we tried, and maybe for a time we were being more humane in terms of the political discourse, but it doesn't seem to have lasted.
No, and I think that's the really sad thing. I mean, as you say, John, we've been here before with the terrible murder of Joe Cox, but, you know, going back years, you know, when you and I were knocking around Parliament, we know the huge pressure, and we know the sort of Punch and Judy show of Prime Minister's Question Time. We've seen and heard the most appalling things said by MPs, about MPs, you know, in and out of the Commons chamber. But as Nigel says, a lot of it's social media. You know, there was a time when you look at green ink and, you know, capital letters and scribbly handwriting, and you think, I'll put that on the dealing with it later part. But of course, you don't have any of those sort of flags on social media. Something comes through, it's an email, it's too late, or, you know, a Twitter or something like that, and you've seen it, and it's very difficult to know what to do. I mean, this is a very unusual intervention by the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, in an interview, it's an article he's written for the Observer, and, you know, he has control over how people behave to each other within the Commons, and, you know, it's accompanied by that same photograph of Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson together, which you don't very often see apart from the opening of Parliament and on Remembrance Day. But there has got to be a better level of respect for everybody in public service, because it isn't just MPs, it's their staff as well, many of whom will be working as volunteers, many of them who will be young, many of them who will live in constituencies and are having to deal with stuff when the MPs are at Westminster. I mean, we cannot go on talking to each other as though there are no consequences. And, you know, we've heard it from GPs, we've heard it from people on frontline emergency staff. This is where it ends. And, you know, there has got to be a turning point where everybody just tones it down, just, you know, calm down a bit, don't get so angry. And the example has got to come, I'm afraid, from the leaders of the parties.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, it's interesting, Nigel, on the top of the Independent, pointing up columns inside the Independent, or to be found online in the Independent, Jess Phillips, stop dehumanising people who serve. I mean, it's inescapable, isn't it, to think back just a few weeks to the Labour Party conference and the row over Angela Rayner's use of the word scum to provide Tories. And she says, look, that's just how I feel. This is what I feel about the things they've stood for. But you use language like that, and I'm not saying it has direct consequences, but it kind of does add to that kind of gradual sort of dehumanising of the people involved, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And in fairness to Angela Rayner, she did withdraw that word. But of course, she shouldn't have used it in the first place. I mean, the essential thing is that in politics, language must be temperate and reasonable. You're putting across an argument, and you can do that without insulting your opponent. What you're trying to do is persuade them. Now, most politicians, in fairness, do that. You have the odd case where they don't. But I think that the Speaker's intervention is absolutely right, and Lindsay Hoyle was absolutely right to say this. Everybody must remember when they're in public life that every word they utter matters, and they have to watch every one.
Now let's talk about what is on the front of the Independent. It's mentioned in a couple of other papers. Patel draws up police protection plan for MPs. The essence of this appears to be that police will, or at least MPs will be offered a police presence at their weekly surgeries.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, they had some MPs today come in with problems, sometimes with grievances. What they want to do is to talk privately to their MP and for their MP to listen to them. So they would rather the police weren't around, but of course, in some cases, it's a necessity.
Joe, I mean, that might be difficult if you've come in to... It might make you think twice about coming in to talk to your MP about the bad treatment you say you've had from the police. So.
Well, exactly. I mean, there are any number of scenarios where you would think that people would not want to go somewhere where there was a police officer. And I think, we've heard Tobias Elwood earlier today saying that MPs should suspend for the time being face-to-face meetings until a review is carried out. I mean, it's very difficult because even if you had a police officer at a constituency surgery, you can't have a police officer when an MP is going to open a fete or go to a school open event. MPs are out and about quite rightly in their constituency. We shouldn't have to get to the stage where they have to have police protection, because that way lies the end of democracy. And okay, there's an awful lot of stuff, and I'm sure over the last 18 months, a lot of constituency surgery work has been dealt with by Zoom and other online things, as indeed has the House of Commons and the Select Committee hearings. But people have got to be able to feel they can go in. And don't forget, for many people, when they get to their MP, it is the last resort, whether they've been battling with the council over housing or care issues. Sometimes they get there and they are desperate.
Yeah. We'll leave this David Amis story. I know it's one we'll be returning to certainly tomorrow on the papers, I'm quite sure. Let's two other stories we can just look at briefly. Joe, the Sunday Telegraph. It's Europe again, but the other bit of Europe, the non-European Union bit of Europe. Dominic Raab is picking up the mantle, which I think was last held by Theresa May, of something must be done about the Human Rights Act and the European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights. Get the right court.
Well, Dominic Raab, who's the newly demoted Justice Secretary, but also Deputy Prime Minister. He is well known for not believing in the Human Rights Act. I mean, he said that very many years ago. This is basically, it's an interview with the Sunday Telegraph repeating what he said at the Conservative Party conference, and he's using the old mantra of it's ridiculous people can claim the human right to a family life, and that means we can't deport dangerous criminals. For instance, I mean, the argument against this is that without the Human Rights Act, the Hillsborough families, the Mint staff's hospital deaths families, and many other cases would not have got the justice that they eventually partially got after many years campaigning. So, he's been heavily criticised, not just by groups like Liberty, but also by the Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy. But of course, this plays well to a certain group of the Tory faithful, and it's Dominic Raab finding something to do, but, arguably there are other things he could be doing would be more useful.
Nigel, you might call this blue meat. I mean, it's sort of thing is thrown to the party faithful. But even the party faithful must have noticed by now that after 10 years or more of promises about the Human Rights Act, nothing has actually changed under Conservative governments or Conservative-led governments.
Well, largely because I mean, we helped to create the European Court of Human Rights, and actually it does a rather good job for the most part. So I worry about Dominic Raab. When I heard it mentioned at the Tory conference, I didn't like the sound of it, but I really do worry the idea that they could be overruled by our Supreme Court. I mean, think of just as one judgment to pluck out of the air, that it was illegal to be a gay man or a lesbian woman in the armed forces right up until the year 2000. And decades before homosexuality had been legalised, nobody would do anything about that. No one would stop it. Soldiers were being jailed for having gay relationships. It was the European Court of Human Rights that overturned that and lifted the ban. Now that's the kind of thing it could do. It has done. And I worry that Dominic Raab will stop those things happening in future.
Nigel, very briefly with both of you, because we'll do more on this in the next paper review just after 11:30. Treasury leak. The Chancellor's not sounding quite so keen on zero carbon as the Prime Minister is. Nigel?
Sorry, I'm sorry. Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, Chancellors and Prime Ministers often have rows on the basis that the Prime Minister usually wants to spend money, and the Chancellor wants to save it. And of course, Rishi Sunak has got an awful lot to save after what has been spent on COVID. But this row is over COP26. It is about, he's worried that the economy will go downhill if Boris Johnson spends too much money. The counter-argument, of course, is that green jobs actually would boost the economy. And again, just plucking one example out, our steel industry still uses fossil fuels. It should use hydrogen, as they do in Scandinavia. If it did, there'd be many more global markets who in future will be buying green steel.
Joe, you've got about 30 seconds.
Economy.
Sorry, Nigel. Joe, you've got about 30 seconds.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to this.
Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, it does all sound rather familiar, doesn't it? Treasury and or number 11 and number 10 at odds with each other, and one wonders whether Rishi Sunak isn't trying to distance himself a little bit, because COP26 looks as though it might be a flop 26, and actually maybe he just wants to let Boris Johnson carry the can for that.
Provocative stuff. We will take that up. We will take that up with you both after 11:30. Go and have a leisurely look through the papers and a glass of something, and we'll see you in about 35 minutes. Thanks so much, Nigel Nelson and Joe Phillips there. Thank you for your company. I'll be back at the top of the hour.